here.
Yeah, and
then come back and sit down.
Exactly.
All right, got it. Okay. That's what we say.
There we go. Well, thanks everyone, and welcome, including those watching online, to this Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center event on how technological innovation is reshaping global and regional economic landscapes and societies, as well as geopolitics. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm a senior vice president here at the Atlantic Council and the director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. And I'm really delighted to welcome you all and to extend a warm welcome to our guests from Hong Kong, especially Secretary for Commerce and Economic Development Edward Yao. We're very thankful to host all of you here today for a very important and timely discussion. We all know the fourth industrial revolution is well underway, with the conjunction of new technologies such as artificial intelligence, biotechnology, the Internet of Things, and the list goes on. These are looking to create new synergies that no country can really afford to ignore. Just this morning, or late yesterday, there was a new report from Congress on how the United States can better leverage artificial intelligence, just as the most recent example. A lot of these technologies and the innovation that's around them can help really do a lot of things differently to fundamentally transform how we identify and treat disease, how we provide for food and energy for our communities, manufacturing and trading goods, managing our homes and our cities. But beyond the economic and societal possibilities, these technologies also present profound strategic challenges, but also strategic opportunities. There's a dual-use nature of these technologies, and national strategies have to explicitly address the new challenges that they pose on the battlefield, such as potential offensive uses of biotechnology or the deployment of intelligent and autonomous weapon systems. In the Scowcroft Center, certainly we are determined to explore the long-term strategic implications of what we sometimes call geotech, a term that captures the strategically transformative role that emerging technology is playing globally already and has played in previous historic eras. In the Scowcroft Center, we work very hard to honor General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embody his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership in cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. And that's why we are so deeply invested and investing in facing the challenges and opportunities created by geotech head on. Just last June in this room, we released the results of a 2-year landmark study by our Foresight Strategy and Risks Initiative that was called the Global Innovation Sweepstakes. The team of analysts did a global tour of technology hubs and learned cutting-edge best practices regarding tech-based innovation, the main point of which was to help the United States reinvigorate its technology edge in a much more crowded and contested field. Today's event represents a really great opportunity to explore how the U.S., Hong Kong, and China have worked to develop their own models of innovation. It provides us with an opportunity to look at the emerging spaces for collaboration and competition that will shape how the world develops and adapts these technologies that may fundamentally reshape our way of life on the planet. As a reminder, this event is being webcast live and is on the record. Please join the conversation on Twitter using hashtag ACAsia and at the Scowcroft Center Twitter account, which is at ACScowcroft. At this point, I'd like to introduce my good friend, Dr. Kurt Campbell. Kurt is the chairman and CEO of the Asia Group, LLC, the board chairman and co-founder of the Center for a New American Security, a non-resident fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center, and vice chairman of the East-West Center in Hawaii. This January, he was named the Henry A. Kissinger Fellow at the McCain Institute, and somehow he had time to join us despite all these responsibilities. As many of you no doubt know, he served as the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 2009 to 13, where he was widely credited as being a key architect of the rebalance to Asia under the Obama administration. We're very lucky to have him here with us. I look forward to hearing his insights, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barry. And let me commend you and the Atlantic Council for the tremendous work that you've undertaken in launching the Scowcroft Center and making sure that it is responsive to the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. Let me also just take a moment. I want to welcome our friends from Hong Kong. We're still in an environment, hopefully, where we welcome friends who come to visit. I hope, I think, at least. I haven't seen the recent speech at the UN this morning, so that may all be off now. But still, I do want to say we have old friends, very good friends in Hong Kong. It's always appreciated when you come visit. We learn an enormous amount from you, and I look forward to the conversation today. I also want to just say a word to one of the finest diplomats that I've ever had a chance to work with, our ambassador, our consul general in Hong Kong. Kurt Tong is with us as well, escorting the delegation. Let me pay tribute to your service, Kurt, and thank you for joining us today. So I just want to say a couple of words about the U.S.-China relationship and then introduce my friend Edward to you so you can hear from him. I know you're here to listen to him, but I will say I was in China last week for the China Development Forum, and we all spent a lot of our time traveling in Asia, and I spent hundreds of trips. I will say I found myself in conversations with senior Chinese leaders last week as they were digging in for what will likely be a very long-term, bitter, unremitting, probably unrewarding set of economic challenges with the United States, wondering whether the people that were manning the docks at Suez, decades ago, realized that they were on the cusp of history. Literally, that's how it felt in Beijing last week, a real sense that the aircraft carrier, or the tanker that is the U.S.-China relationship, is really veering in some difficult directions. And I'm not sure any of us are prepared for the set of challenges ahead. I'm one who firmly believes that the United States and China, despite our difficulties, despite our differences, must come to terms and find a way to share responsibilities and power in the 21st century. That path is being made much more difficult, and the challenges ahead are enormous across the board, strategically, economically, and politically. In the spirit of that set of challenges, I'm afraid to say that our friends in Hong Kong are going to take on even more responsibility. Hong Kong is unique in the sense that it represents not only China in a very complex way, but also is a bridge. It has always been a bridge to the West. And I think one of the reasons that we're grateful for Edward visiting is that he comes at a time where we have almost no dialogue strategically between the United States and China. And I'm afraid in the time ahead, Hong Kong is increasingly going to be asked to play a role as an interpreter, as a bridge, as a leading effort in encouraging dialogue, trying to find common ground and very forward. And that's why when Barry asked me, I was so pleased to change a schedule to come and welcome Edward, who is an old friend and one of the most innovative players in Hong Kong. His newest responsibility, he's had this job for about a year, is Secretary of Economic Development and Commerce in Hong Kong. And what that means is he is responsible with coming up with innovative strategies, how to keep Hong Kong on the cutting edge, how to invest in training and education, identify technologies and capabilities that will keep Hong Kong relevant in Asia and the world economy in the 21st century. During my travels, my opportunities in government and subsequently, I've met very few people who are more innovative and insightful and also a fantastic listener. I'm grateful that Edward took the time to come visit the United States. I wanted to come here and pay my respects to him personally, and I'm looking forward to hear what he has to say today. So Edward, I'm not going to give they have your bio. You already feel good. You talk to your family all the time, so I'm not gonna go through it. But I want to welcome you here today to the Atlantic Council and ask you to come up and speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kurt and Barry and friends. Thank Kurt for his very kind words and very flattering. But I know, well, you entertain, also receive a lot of speakers here. It's in fact a very important stage where through the Atlantic Council connect not just to America but the world. So thank you in particular for lending us this platform. I must also sort of tell the audience through you that I'm not coming alone. As a government official, I'm come here and supported by my tiny, small, but very influential office here in Washington, D.C., the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office around DuPont Circle, which I had the privilege of working there some 15 years ago, and that's where I met with Kurt and many of friends here. I'm also accompanied by Hong Kong standard, not a small group of delegates joining me. We took advantage of a direct flight introduced by the Cathay Pacific, connecting Hong Kong within 14 hours to Dallas Airport, which will be operated on a daily basis, right, John? Beginning with four times a week. But okay. Taking that advantage, I'm bringing along a group which composed of business leaders, including AmCham, the chairman and president here, the Hong Kong U.S. Business Council, and also basically all the heads of Hong Kong Chambers of Commerce here, and also have the chairman of the Hong Kong Bar Association, and also one of the speakers later today, a young gentleman, Steve, who is our future, a unicorn startup in Hong Kong. So all these are just a cross-section of Hong Kong that I believe are familiar to the U.S. community here, because, well, people usually see Hong Kong in that manner, a very dynamic economic financial center, and with a lot of investment in the region, in particular mainland China. But I think there is also the untold story that actually Hong Kong has something rather special, and not just another Chinese city, which is the constitutional arrangement for Hong Kong to represent ourselves quite separately, quite uniquely within our nation. The basic law, which is the Constitution for Hong Kong, stipulates that Hong Kong can represent ourselves as a separate trading and also custom territory. That provides the basis for Hong Kong to take part in our own right, in our own name, using Hong Kong, China, to be a separate member of WTO, World Customs Organization, allowing us to sit along with our sort of our mainland counterpart as well as the U.S. counterpart. So we are one of the 164 members in WTO. Not that much known to people that, well, actually our economic presence is slightly bigger than our sheer size. That despite we're just a tiny place of 1,000 km square, 7.3 million people, we are actually the world's #7 trading entity, and the world's 10th largest trade and services entity. So that has given Hong Kong perhaps the opportunity to rub shoulder with the bigger power in economic and financial senses. And also in our time zone, I think basically Hong Kong is the financial center for the Asian time zone, alongside with, say, London for Europe and here New York for US. Now, I give this perspective because we believe, well, Hong Kong is having a place that would be of significance of the world, despite our distance, our size. Distance can very easily be bridged by airline, communication, technology, but more important by people who know us, and also Hong Kong people knowing people and community here. Also, I think we come at the interesting time when I talk to Kurt, well, whether we're coming at the right time or the wrong time, I think we both conclude diplomatically it is an interesting time, because as we see the world seem to be getting a bit strange or not as familiar as before, certainly from where Hong Kong stands. Because Hong Kong is traditionally a trader. We, in our blood, we trade and we do finance. trade constitutes over 300% of our GDP. And trade and logistics are the single biggest pillar of Hong Kong's economy, constituting 22% of GDP. So in a way, we live on trade. We live on trade not by any other means, but turning open the place to be the best trading city in the world. There is no economic barriers to trade. Quite the contrary, we try to sort of invite people as much as they could make use of Hong Kong as the trading ground. And being a founding member of WTO right from the start, or even in the GATT days, Hong Kong has imposed no tariff on anything import or export. And 8 years ago, we made one additional measure of lowering the remaining duty for wine, which immediately made Hong Kong now the world's biggest wine trading center. So you can see that, well, that's what we believe and what we practice. So I think this is a very interesting time when the traditional thinking of Hong Kong in doing trade and being a global financial center caught with dispute among big players. Where do we stand? I think that's the question that we are going to ask and also to discuss. I came to DC end of last week, bring along some of the questions that I want to ask when I meet with the administration and calling on the Hill, and also meeting people from the think tank. But it seems the process has given me more question than answer. But people assure me that, well, that's the new normal, that's the norm. So, but allow me to generalize in the last couple of days, three more questions that I would ask myself, and I will share with the audience here, and perhaps we together to find some answer. Would that be all right? Now, these three questions are, of course, from where Hong Kong stands, right? It may not be applicable to your own sort of domestic export. It may not be applied across the board to every corner of the globe. But these are very important questions for a small but significant economic player in a highly changing global economy. The three questions are, first, is free trade free? And is fair trade fair? Isn't that a fair question? The first question. The second question, does trade wind still prevails if hurricane becomes the new normal? It's more climatic, okay? The third one, would Hong Kong abandon free trade if and when others drop it? Okay, these are genuine questions. I'll tackle them one by one, but allow me to be very honest. I don't necessarily have all the answer, and perhaps my answer might be challenged by other people, because practicing makes things perfect. And I think we, in this time and age, we can't be too philosophical or theoretical. Now, is free trade free? Meaning that, well, we all subscribe to the idea of free trade. When I go to WTO meetings, ministerial meeting, I don't think any nation, any economy would claim themselves going contrary to free trade. But as a matter of practice, I think year after year, we're all talking about how to make trade freer, easier. And since the conclusion of the Uruguay round, there seems to be no prospect. The Doha agenda is still on the table. There are a number of new issues already running old, but still untouched. So is free trade that difficult to attain? And I think there is also a misconception that, well, free trade is something very handy, very easy, low-hanging fruit. But as a matter of reality, I think that the contrary is right. Because free trade does not mean it's free, or whether it will be very easily attainable. Quite the contrary, I think, even for Hong Kong, who is a practitioner of free trade comes with a price. The price is, of course, if you believe in competitive advantage, there are certain areas you are less competitive, and therefore you lose out in certain area. But I think the beauty of free trade is it's not a zero-sum game. That means 1 + 1 equal to a sum bigger than 2. It's simple arithmetic. But that does not mean that it's free. And I recorded that earlier this year in Davos, in the World Economic Forum, there's one session chaired by IMF President Christine Lagarde, and also my Chief Executive Carrie Lam attended. The question of globalization came up, which resembled this question. Everybody says, well, globalization is good, but obviously globalization also brings out problems that we all encounter, particularly the matter or the divide between the have and the have-not, which in a way very much resemble the global trading system now. It's a matter of distribution. But my chief executive, in response to a question, says that, well, while we know globalization is good for all, the problem of globalization needs to be tackled, particularly the issue of distribution. But the responsibility to tackle distribution, primarily, I think, will fall on individual government. And Hong Kong is no exception. Hong Kong is also suffering from the, while increasing affluence, but the disparity between the have and have-not are widening. Look at the property market, look at the younger generation not affording the rental. But that also comes back that, well, in the last couple of years, the biggest expenditure of the Hong Kong government has been the increase in the welfare sector. In the last 5 years, we have increased our welfare spending by 71%. Which I would address is something to top up the have-nots. And it can never be enough. So these are attempts that individual government would have to tackle the distribution problem instead of putting the blame on the bigger community where we all are. And also there are also measures not confining to sort of subsidizing those who are lack of means. Even in the trading system, government should play a role of facilitation. While we Hong Kong believe in market, we also need to balance some of the disparity by people who might have gained early access to the system, or like Steve's case, new startups, they also need some help. So what did we do a year ago when the new term of government came into office? We did three things. One, we cut the tax by half, focusing on SME. But on a level playing field, we couldn't identify who are actually small. So we did it by halving the already low profit tax down to 8.25% for the initial 2 million profit that we make. So point number one, people pay less tax. And secondly, we have a super deduction for INT, which is relevant to Barry's introduction in the INT world, and particularly for startup. In order to help them to ease their way in, you have to help them. The best way is, in fact, to give them bigger deductions, 300%. That means they do not only get a tax exemption, but also get a tax credit for future profit they are making. So these are measures that we are trying to help. The third measure is introduced earlier this year by injecting into two funds which support our SMEs going out to do branding, marketing, and also upgrading of their product, which are not confined to doing in Hong Kong, but also in Southeast Asia, where we have entered into a new trade agreement with. So in a way, free trade is not free, that we need to do some remedial work to make sure that the impact of imbalance could be sort of leveled off in certain way to minimize the impact of trade. But likewise, I cannot articulate on fair trade in the same way as I did for free trade, because whose fairness? In what way we measure fair trade? So I will pause on fair trade, but focus just on free trade. The second question is, does trade wind still prevail if hurricane becomes normal? Because, well, I did geography in my college days, and I still remember, well, looking at the world climate, there was something called trade wind, which is the prevailing wind because of pressure, because of rotation of Earth. Somehow, somewhat, there is a pattern of certain wind in certain sector, like between the tropical and temperate region. Winds always blow throughout the year or certain part of the year in a certain direction in a more predictable way. In a way that resembles the traditional trading system that we are all more familiar with. I think in post-war years, basically the whole world is moving towards encouraging trade by lowering tariff, reducing barriers. As a result, we all got more prosperous by trading more, getting income. So I would say that's the so-called trade wind. And as the name suggests, well, the old sort of sailing merchants are also riding on that wind to go to a destination they want to go to. But of course, in the high sea, there is no guarantee that, well, there will be always a sort of a blue sky or peaceful ocean. At times, there will be cyclones. Or in this part of the world, you call it hurricane. On our part of the world, it's called typhoon. But it seems coincide with climate change if we talk about that global warming, warmer ocean seem to generate more sort of a high power, intense cyclones. You have just had the Florence. We also had a similar sort of a very strong gusty typhoon in our part of the world, resemble like the trade dispute that we are encountering these days. But how do we, traders, global traders, or big or small, handle these two forces of nature? One is more certain, prevailing, the other at times less predictable. I think the reality both would happen. But in preparing ourselves, should we be just preparing for the hurricane at the expense of the opportunity given in the trade wind? I think that's the question that we have to think about. So I'm just using this analogy as a trigger for us to think about where do we go. Of course, there is no way we can prevent the happening of hurricane, cyclones, but what are the usual days? Are we just trying to avoid those, bypassing, moving away? Or do we build wars among ourselves to prevent it? Or if we're all in the same boat in the high sea, where one may not be just escaped it, whether we paddle together to ride out the storm, or we jump the ship, abandon it, and go to the high sea? Well, I think those are questions that we can answer together if we believe we are all in the same boat. So the last one is, will Hong Kong abandon free trade if another sort of trying to sort of walk away from it? And certainly, well, you will find the answer from my analysis and my opening remarks. While Hong Kong is in fact the first to suffer from any trade dispute because we don't have any defense. We are most vulnerable. We're most open. We are in fact the biggest sort of a trading agent and also the financial center servicing trade in our part of the world or in the wider world. So in a way, we are defenseless. But having said that, I don't think it's in our DNA that we will do anything tit for tat. Rather, I think we will be the ones who are still knocking on people's door, trying to bring people together for the very simple reason that I've outlined in the first two questions. If we're in the same boat, what would we do? In the time of rough weather, what should we do? And in the time of doubt, should we be just walk away? Should we be just sort of blaming each other? Or should we, like the airline that brought us here, reconnect? Or even sort of bridging over doubts and differences? So these are the questions, unfortunately, I bring to you asking for your wisdom, as I always did in my last 20 years in working with this part of the world, working with mainland, and also happy to see you all here. And also, hopefully, well, perhaps we can resolve that answer by traveling more to our part of the world so that you can feel the climate change and ride on the trade wind. And I think we would like to see you in Hong Kong as well. Thank you.
Well, welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Robert Donor. I'm Senior Fellow here at the Council. It's a pleasure for me to follow Secretary Yao and Kurt Campbell, in particular on a set of issues that are extremely important, in fact central to the development of the world economy, and are at the heart of tensions in economic and international security relations. Technology issues have become paramount in economic development, in growth of new activity. The world is changing away from manufacture of goods towards services. It's changing in the development of new technologies, and technologies of a character that are different, networked, broad, data dependent from things that we've seen before, the process and production technologies. We're fortunate here in having a panel that's rare by the standards of this community. It's a panel that combines technologists, entrepreneurs and businessmen, and policy analysts to focus on the issues of global competitiveness, innovation, and the competition among nations. It also follows up the Council's study on the Innovation Sweepstakes, which looked precisely at these issues and the things that individual economies are doing and can do in the current environment. I'd like to introduce the speakers in the order that I'm going to ask them to speak. The first is Samuel Klein, who's Assistant Director of the Foresight Strategy and Risk Initiative here at the Council. He was editor and also contributor to the Council study, the Global Innovation Sweepstakes. He's also worked here and at George Washington University on cybersecurity initiatives. Second, I'll ask Professor John Chai to speak. Professor Chai is the Managing Director of Phuc Tin Group Holdings, a diversified group of companies that manufactures and distributes electronic products, healthcare, and medical devices, and many other products as well. Professor Chai is also a member of the Hong Kong Chief Executive's Council of Advisors on Innovation and Strategic Development. He's a former professor at Northwestern University and now an honorary professor at Hong Kong's Polytechnic University. Next is Stephen Lam. The best way to introduce Mr. Lam, I think, is that he is what I wish I had been. Educated at the Haas School of Business at Berkeley. He's the co-founder of GoGoVan, which is well understood by its short description. It's the Uber of freight and goods movements within urban areas. It started in Hong Kong, but it's quickly spread to cities in China, India, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. And, as W.C. Fields might have put it, anybody who describes himself as the cheaper everything officer can't be all bad. Last is Stephanie Siegel, the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow of the Simon Chair of Political Economy at Center for Strategic and International Studies. Formerly, she was Director of the Asia Office at Treasury, and before that, a senior economist at the IMF. She and I were colleagues at the Treasury Department, and I can tell you from long experience that policy shops, both in the US government and international organization, deal in wishful thinking. But very little wishful thinking ever survived an encounter with Stephanie. So it's a pleasure for me to moderate this panel. I'm sure that I'll have lots of questions before I turn the panel over to all of you. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of the panelists to speak for about 7 to 10 minutes. I'm going to ask a few questions and try to provoke a discussion among the panel members, and then we'll turn the panel over to all of you. So Samuel Klein, would you kick us off?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Donor, for the introduction. I also just wanted to thank Dr. Campbell as well for joining us, and Secretary Yao too. And for those of you in the audience visiting from Hong Kong and watching online, I hope everyone made it through the recent typhoon safely and that recovery efforts are going well. Having come from Boston, I can't say that I've lived through a typhoon, but when we have snowstorms that get nicknames like Snowmageddon, Snowpocalypse, I certainly understand that it can be a trying time to make it through those, so I hope everything is going well. Being the Atlantic Council representative here on the panel today, I thought I would spend a bit of time talking about our recent reports on technology innovation and some of the fact-finding trips that we've conducted. Over the past 2 years, we've put out 2 reports, the first one focusing mostly on innovation in the United States, and the second one looking more globally at tech hubs around the world. For each of the reports, we followed a similar methodology. We selected a handful of tech hubs to visit, and then in each of those locations, we sought to meet with as broad and diverse a group of people as possible. Everyone from CEOs and entrepreneurs such as yourself, Stephen, to university professors and faculty, policymakers, scientists, engineers, really trying to get a better understanding for what innovation looks like on the ground, how it's taking shape, what their strengths and weaknesses are. The main motivation for the project, looking historically, the United States has been the world's leader in innovation, stemming from investments that it made out of World War II, close collaboration between the US government and Silicon Valley. But more recently, that is certainly no longer the case. There are other tech hubs, not just Silicon Valley, but elsewhere within the United States that are rising, and around the world too. So we really sought to gain a better understanding of how the innovation landscape is changing and what it looks like today. So during our trips throughout the United States, we visited Madison, Wisconsin, Boulder and Denver, Colorado, Austin, Texas, and then we finished up in the San Francisco Bay Area and in Silicon Valley. Of course, that's not an exhaustive list, but those were, we thought, geographically dispersed and would provide different perspectives. For the second year, when we went globally, we went to several hubs in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. Of course, for budget and time reasons, we couldn't visit everywhere, but we really sought to, again, try to provide a diverse perspective. In terms of some of the main takeaways, like I mentioned, Silicon Valley is still the world's leader in innovation, but is by no means the only player in the game anymore. When we went to visit the region and spoke with experts on the ground, a lot of them still think that is the case. They have a bit of a chip on their shoulder, to say it politely, that they think that they are the center of the world, the center of the universe in terms of tech innovation. But there are really some fascinating and interesting things going on the ground in Austin, Texas, in Madison, Wisconsin, these other areas. And Secretary Yao had mentioned Steve Case, his Rise of the Rest project. He's really put a spotlight on some of these areas. Pittsburgh, for example, being in the Rust Belt, has really reinvented itself as a place for emerging technologies like autonomous vehicles, robotics, biotechnology, and other things like that. So there is still a very vibrant innovation ecosystem in the United States, but there is more that could be done. Increased investment in research and development. If you look at a lot of the trends, historically, most of the investment in basic R&D has come from the public sector, but that has declined and been replaced by the private sector. Really, the public sector is the one that's able to take on those risks and have a more long-term view to reap the benefits necessary for basic R&D. The private sector isn't necessarily as well placed to do that. So it's really important to make sure that those trends are reversed. Education and skills training is also very important. You see a lot of intermediary institutions in the United States, such as accelerators, incubators, boot camps. Those also are filling a very important role as new skills are needed, as workers transition from previous jobs to the new jobs of the 21st century. When we went on our trips around the world, one of the things that stood out to us is that you find foosball tables everywhere. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that just by buying a foosball table, all of a sudden you're the most innovative country in the world and you're going to become a unicorn with a $1 billion valuation. But the point being was that other regions get it. They understand what is needed for innovation. They understand the investments that they need to make. Some of the things that Secretary Yao pointed out in terms of the tax credits and helping IT and focusing on education. It's very clear that Hong Kong understands what's needed to foster innovation, and they've seen great success with that. We visited China. That was one of the countries we went to on our global tour. We went to Beijing and Shanghai, and we were certainly impressed by what we saw on the ground. A lot of people say that China, Beijing is the next Silicon Valley. I still think there are, we just have to watch these trends play out and see what might happen in the future. There are a lot of advantages that I think Silicon Valley still has over China, but they certainly understand what is necessary. They have focus from the highest level of government. They are investing in research and development, in education. They have similar incubators and accelerators as well. Their younger generation is optimistic about the future. When we spoke with them, many said that it was only a matter of time until they became the most innovative in the world. So a lot of interesting things going on there. Of course, there are some disadvantages that they have as well. There were mixed reactions about education in China. Some thought that they were headed in the right direction, and that they were focusing on STEM education. Others seemed to think that it was a quality versus quantity issue, and that they might have the quantity, but the quality might not be there just yet. And of course, there are very important structural issues to focus on as well. I imagine these might come up, or my other panelists might focus on, in terms of forced technology transfer, having to establish joint ventures. Looking at this from an American business point of view, there's still a lot of concerns about how the Chinese were able to innovate so quickly. The last thing that I might just end on, another interesting observation that we made while in the country, was that there may seem to be different definitions of what innovation exactly is. So in the United States, when we would go to Silicon Valley and talk about innovation, we would often discuss the creation of foundational new technologies like the internet, like GPS, things of those nature. In China, it was much more focused on adapting or absorbing existing technologies, but for the Chinese market. So we spoke with some people who considered high-speed rail to be a Chinese innovation, and while certainly they have the most rail in the world, I think almost up to 30,000 kilometers now, the foundational technology for that came from the French and the Japanese. So that was a little bit of an interesting perspective. AI might be the new case, where that is a foundational new technology that they may certainly beat the United States to in terms of its development. So I might pause there.
So I'm waiting to hear whether Professor Chai's companies have foosball tables or not. But,
yeah, we actually do. So let me pick up on the last point that Samuel was making and then carry on. I don't know whether my mic is on. The last point on definition of innovation and technology, I guess it really depends on that type of technology and what stage of it is at its development, how fundamental is the technology. We used to joke about what R&D means, and of course we know R&D is research and development, but in some part of the world R&D is replication and duplication. So, so I think that philosophically, innovation and technology, we measure the impact. When is it really matter to us as human mankind is when it really impacts how we live, how society functions, whether or not it influences economy or whatnot. Now, before I go into giving the background of what the Hong Kong government has been doing with innovation and technology, I want to bring innovation and technology into a slightly different perspective. we talk today about innovation technology creating new ways of living, but do not forget that it is not new innovation and technology that we concentrate on. We need to remember what are the innovations that has happened before that change how we live. You look at electricity, you look at the discovery of plastic. Now those fundamentally change how we live. So it's not that we have forgotten innovation and technology. All of a sudden everyone's on the bandwagon trying to seek for the latest innovation and technology. That is always within our blood and within the blood of our Hong Kong people. Now, regarding the current government's initiative on innovation and technology, I want to make maybe 2 to 3 points. One is that government has the absolute resolve into putting the right resource into innovation and technology, and I do realize that I think they do understand the overall landscape. They do understand what is required from the government's role to trigger private entities into making the case. Now, just to give an example, the budget plan that was released earlier in March this year, that was 50 billion Hong Kong dollars, which translate to about 6.5 billion US in a small little place called Hong Kong, to put money into innovation and technology, and among them roughly 10 billion into 2 particular clusters. One cluster is AI and robotics, the other cluster is medical or healthcare technology. Another 10 billion into upgrading what we call the science park in Hong Kong is an incubation hub, is quite sizable. Another billion put in the existing sort of the Sing Fund for Innovation and Technology Funding, the ITF. Now 20 billion put in just leveling the land into a small area, which I would mention is 1 kilometer square piece of land called the Lok Ma Chau Loop. I go into that a little later on, which will be maybe the 3rd science park after the Hong Kong Science Park and the Cyberport in Hong Kong. I'll go into that a little later on. And then so on. Okay, so 50 billion is a resolve there, but then the implementation would take years to happen. Now, understanding that innovation technology is not only about infrastructure build, it's not only about resource, it's about the pipeline of talent. I think is a utmost important concept, is the flow of talent. How do we harness the talent from university onwards, okay, into entrepreneurs, into startups, and then into real businesses. Now, without too much publicity, if we look at the 8 Hong Kong institutions, higher ed institutions, universities that are funded by the government, 5 of them consistently rank within the world's 100 by a certain ranking called QS. It's a European ranking. Now, we know that we don't use US News and Report because they do not rank us as high, but we tend to use QS. No, but it's an international ranking, consistently ranked within top 5. And Hong Kong is the single city that has the most number of highly ranked university within the top 100. So you look at the profile of higher ed in Hong Kong. Of course, the ranking is about education quality, it's about research quality. So let's not forget where we have talents. Now, we've played a role for the last 20 years in training not only our local talent, but many talents from the region, not only in mainland, but in Southeast Asia also. So watch how the talent flow. Now, we understand that we cannot keep all the talent because of the employment prospect and so forth, okay? We realized that 20 years ago when China opens up, a lot of the industries moved north. So we are not, it's not that we forgot innovation and technology, we still own them, but just we Hong Kong businessmen own them through our China companies in China. So that is the distinction. Now, back to the point of schemes to attract talent. There are many schemes already released by the government in maintaining and attracting talent. There's a new scheme called TAG, immigration program. Is a scheme that would allow foreign graduates who are graduate of a certain degree and a certain ranking of university to allow them to work in Hong Kong, okay, without a lot of scrutiny, okay, so long they are graduates or at the master level and or with work experience at the bachelor level. And the idea is that we keep these talent, and at the same time there's this program called Postdoc Hub. So government is sponsoring 55,000 Hong Kong, which is about six grand, okay, $6,000 per month for each one of these PhD qualified candidates to work in companies through certain companies, certain schemes. So all these are a way of attracting and maintaining talent. Now there's another scheme that is quite interesting that I need to mention. Now, we think of Hong Kong as part of China, which is the absolute fact, but then we operate different system. The education and its funding for education and research are entirely separate. So there's a new scheme that's released earlier in May. Now, I'm going to read the headline, and the headline has 2 points to make. Now, this is from South China Morning Post on May 14th. In a potential game-changing for Hong Kong's high-tech industry, local scientists will have greater access to nationals level grant funding, which were only once available to mainland Chinese entities. After President Xi Jinping directed the state agencies to help the city, second point, become an international innovation hub. Now the backdrop of this message is that there's a plan called Greater Bay Area Plan. Greater Bay Area. Now the Bay Area, it immediately connotes the San Francisco Bay Area, the New York Bay Area, the Tokyo Bay Area. Now we do have a Bay Area. We have a Pearl River Delta area with neighboring Hong Kong, Macau, and 9 cities. In combination, this economy is about 12.2% of the GDP of China. So it's a very small place occupying a lot of high-tech companies already there. So we already have a Bay Area there. We already have a lot of entrepreneurship, innovation activity over there. Now, what is the next step necessary from government's point of view to make sure that they all work with each other? Now that is the policy point of view, trying to break all the barriers. Just imagine we have 3 custom borders, 1 country, 2 system, with all the cities trying to be the innovation hub. But presidency says that Hong Kong is. Okay, so I'm going to stop at that. Yeah.
So, hello. As you know, my background is I graduated from Harvard Business School in Berkeley, one of the most liberal school in the state. And then now I got a chance to work in Hong Kong, founded a company in Hong Kong, and then expanded to regionally, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, recently India, and we are operating over 300 cities in China. So I have a lot of experience to kind of share with you guys my perspective on what is innovation. First of all, we only got a ping pong table, and that ping pong table is like also our conference table. You know, property price is so expensive in Hong Kong. We just can't afford so many this kind of table in the office. Just make sure they are office space instead of a fun space. But what I want to try to say is, what is innovation? To me, innovation is to use new method to do old things. For Silicon Valley, a lot of innovation is we need to do some groundbreaking stuff, really disruptive, from nothing to something that game-changing. When you look at all these high-tech chips and core tech, For the last 3 to 4 months, there's a huge debate after the ZTE company getting banned by the American governments on the technology side of it. And then the Chinese finally realized, oh, we said we are innovative, but actually we don't have core tech. What I mean is, can we build chips out of China? You know, even though we said everything is made in China, but now when the technologists or VC or private equity guys looking in real tech, can we really produce something like Intel, NVIDIA, CPU, GPU? Can we do it today? Then when we think deeper, we look outside the ocean, actually Taiwan may be able to do it, but not China. But all the Chinese, just like when I was studying in America, so American students are like, we are a very, very strong nation. We are huge. When you work in China, Chinese students, teenagers, there's huge opportunity there. And then there's something that we are the center of the world, not the Silicon Valley. That's quite common in nowadays. When you walk around Beijing, they think they are the center of the world. Okay, honestly, to me, and when I travel all around, they're center of China, not center of the world. Let's see the tech that we developed in China. We really want to get it out to regional. But when you look at Southeast Asia, how all these tech giants, we call it BAT, Baidu, Tencent, Alibaba, these 3 companies, what is the influence of these companies in this region? Just I'm talking about ASEAN, Southeast Pacific, right? But when you look at Google, FANG, Facebook, Amazon, or even Netflix, right? Netflix is huge. These guys are really global. So what is innovation? We have 2 different types of definitions. Then to myself, what I see right now is the innovation that's happening in Southeast Asia is what I call consumer tech, the application layer. Okay, when you take away the iOS and Android, can we build a mobile application just out of China? Yes, but would that be operating on, let's say, BlackBerry, Nokia, or the one very top company that we recently talk about a lot, Xiaomi? Xiaomi built on Android. When we took away the operating system, what do we have? Right now, the innovation is only stopped at consumer tech, the application layer. That's the first point that I have seen and I discovered. Right now, Chinese government and Hong Kong, also the Hong Kong government, try really hard to change the education system so that we can incubate the future scientists to do much more internally. Not to adapt all this technology from Japan to Silicon Valley, right? So that is one thing that I guess from living in Hong Kong, having educated in the States, that's something that we need to focus on. If China or anywhere in the other side of the world, that new technology is coming up, that is actually globally disruptive, that can change the landscape in United States or in China. That would be what I would call it the next level of innovation. That's the real innovation. What that means right now, in 2 years ago, we call it big data. Everyone is like big data. So you're doing big data medical startup, you're doing big data water startup. Anything with big data sounds like innovation. And for the last 2 years, okay, AI, okay? So AI actually building on big data. So I don't know how that differentiates. I'm not a scientist, but it seems like something different. But to me, I guess people just change the name, it's PR thing. But AI can be something fundamentally change the landscape. And China and Hong Kong is getting ready. I cannot speak out of what the Chinese government trying to do, but I was based in Hong Kong and I spent a lot of time with all this, from school professors to startup entrepreneur in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a very exciting time. We have several huge AI technology based in Hong Kong already. That will be the magnet for all these talent that coming to Hong Kong, trying to look for opportunity. In this group of talents, it's the next generation talent. I'm not saying that the regular engineers are trying to build an Android app or iOS app. Something that build an operating system based on AI that work on some kind of product. Maybe an operating system on a robot or autonomous vehicle. I don't know. But that is something that we need to be out on the horizon and look out. Is there some pirate coming? And those guys are the pirate. And right now in Hong Kong, we welcome them. Come on in. What did you learn? Explore around the world. Please come here. If you are a pirate, let's do something here. We build what you learn. All right? That's something that from Hong Kong we are trying to do. Just one case in point. I'm not sure if you guys heard of Sophia. Sophia is the first AI robot that can make facial response to any human being. Okay? Yeah, some of you lot. Yeah. Very, very sassy tech. And I'm not, the robot itself is not sassy at the moment, even though it's a very sassy name, Sophia. But they are making it more and more sassy in terms of technology. So she used to live in Silicon Valley. Now she's a new immigrant to Hong Kong. Around the world, why Hong Kong? That is one question that I have. But the more I try to study this topic, the more I find out that's a huge reason why she is living in Hong Kong and she will living in Hong Kong as a Hong Kong citizen. One major idea is the Greater Bay Area initiative that I think is really, really exciting as an entrepreneur from Hong Kong. It creates a huge opportunity for companies like Sophia to stay in Hong Kong because we have the talent keep coming in. We're a very, very international city, all right? When you live in Hong Kong, you feel like New York. You can party, you can meet a lot of people, or very, very interesting people. And at the same time, if you want to build something just across the street, which is the Shenzhen River, you can buy the cheapest tech component available around the world to build a robot that you need, the AI that you need, with huge engineering base supply from China. So if I'm in a Silicon Valley startup, I'm trying to build a robot. Here in Silicon Valley, it's 100 times much more expensive compared to Hong Kong. And I enjoy the living style of San Francisco and New York by building something very cheap. And at the end of the day, it's scalable around the world. So this is something that I want to showcase to you what's happening on the other side of the world, what we think of innovation and how we challenge ourselves and how Hong Kong is trying to be in that position to fuel the future. So I guess that's it for my point here.
So our first three presentations have concentrated very heavily on technology, technological development, and the tech industry. This is an environment, this takes place in an environment that's changing from policy terms. As Secretary Yao outlined in his keynote address, issues of technology, technological development, and the policies adopted towards technology are at the center of international disputes on trade and economic policy. I'd like to turn next to Stephanie Siegel to talk about the macro and policy environment in which this is taking place.
I'm going to time myself to make sure I stick to the 7-minute guideline here. I think my comments, so I was actually asked to talk about macro level perspective on long-term economic drivers, which sounds really dry after what we just heard from the last three panelists. But I think through that, I can kind of link back to some of the opening comments from Kurt Campbell and from Secretary Yao. And just to give kind of 90 seconds on the macro piece of it and focused here very much on mainland China, for the past 40 plus years, the economy in China was driven by, if we think about kind of typical growth models, labor, a huge influx of labor into the economy, the upgrading of that labor as there was migration from rural areas to urban areas, and then fueled by a huge amount of investment. A lot of that investment, debt-fueled investment. So for decades, that had been the driver of the economic miracle in China, and that was sufficient. But I think then with the global financial crisis, a couple things changed. First, external markets were no longer a driver of growth in China. Some of these other drivers that I talked about, the demographic side, were no longer available. And so China really had to turn more inward, relying on debt-fueled investment for growth. And that works up into a point, but then you reach a point where that investment is just no longer productive in the economy. And so again, if you think in terms of growth models, labor inputs, capital inputs, what's left is something called total factor productivity. And that total factor productivity we can kind of think of as being innovation, right? There needs to be new ways of doing things, disruption as you described it, to make the economy more productive and to raise the growth potential. And that, I would say, is one of the key things that's underlying the big push in China to upgrade the economy. I'll transition now a little bit to some of the tensions that our first speakers talked about. And Made in China 2025 is an official program designed to prioritize some of these key innovative technologies. 10 sectors identified where China wants to become not just the leading domestic provider of these technologies, but a global leader. And it's that technological push that I would argue on one hand is actually motivated by the need to find another driver of growth so that China can actually advance to the next stage in its development. But it's also that push that is now challenging the US-China relationship and really underlies some of the tensions that the first two keynotes talked about. That, I think, is an interesting discussion for us to have and is actually going on as far as what is really motivating that tension in the US-China relationship, and is it something that can be addressed in a constructive way, or are we actually looking at a much longer term period of tension, not just between US and China, but globally. Just to talk a little bit about domestically kind of how that's taking shape, and I think you can look across a couple of different areas. You can look in the trade domain, tensions between US and China. You can look at the investment domain, and that has to do with investment flows between the two countries. And then you can look at kind of the bigger geostrategic issues that I don't feel necessarily qualified to talk to, but that certainly is an element that needs to be taken into account when we're talking about this. On the trade side, and Minister Yao got to this in his comments, but there certainly are tensions in the bilateral relationship, but I wouldn't just limit it to the bilateral relationship. If you're following some of the trade news right now, there are discussions certainly on US-China trade war, but there are other discussions ongoing about the WTO and has it been able to adapt to the realities of a modern economy. And a lot of folks are answering no, that it has not been able to adapt to the realities of digital trade. It has not been up to the task of dealing with certain challenges having to do with state-subsidized industries. And so I think even if you were to get at some of the bilateral issues, there are questions being posed to the multilateral system and get at the core of global trading rules. And that's as big of a challenge, I would say, to trade. On the investment side, and here I'll talk kind of specifically about what's happening in the US, but I think does have much broader implications for globalization, for global investment. Here in the US recently, the president signed into law an upgrade and update to the rules that govern foreign investment screening in the US, something called CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. The reform that was signed into law actually doesn't list China anywhere in there, but a lot of the discussion around the reforms has to do with the perceived risk that Chinese investment in the US poses, as well as the perceived risk that technology transfer from the United States to China, both licit and illicit, poses to the United States. So what has been passed and what will be implemented de facto is probably going to result in declining investment linkages between the U.S. and China, at least in the near term. I kind of link that then to global developments, because I would venture that that's not just going to be a US-China phenomenon. There are other advanced economies that are also taking similar steps to, at a minimum, kind of tighten their investment screening. And the effect of that tightening, one would assume, would be to actually kind of tamp down on some of those flows. And then just to finish off on this kind of broader existential question, geopolitical question about US-China relations, as we were talking before we came on, I'm not sure that it's entirely clear the direction that we're going in, whether this is kind of a short-term phenomenon that we're looking at, or some, including Jack Ma, have speculated that what we're looking at is really a 20-year Cold War. And if that's the case, I think it has implications, certainly beyond just the bilateral relationship. It has implications for the global economy, and even just the direction of globalization, and to the extent the forces that have led to greater globalization and greater integration continue or actually rolled back. So on that less than optimistic note, as Bob mentioned is my nature, I'll stop there.
Well, thanks very much. Ordinarily in a panel like this, I'd have clear questions that I would direct to each panelist. Questions that occur to me, I think, are addressable by any of the panelists, but I'll start by addressing them to one and ask the others to chime in. So let me start with Sam Klein. Almost every economy is trying to develop innovation centers, technological development centers of competitive advantage. What did you find from your studies works? What's most successful? In particular for an economy like Hong Kong, small, urban, concentrated, cosmopolitan, but small. What are likely to be the policies that would be most successful?
Sure, so that's a really good question. To pick up a little bit on what John mentioned, he focused a lot on talent. And I think that's one of the things that really helps to make the innovation ecosystems work. But not just talent, but talent co-located with the research universities and R&D labs. So I didn't mention this before, but one of the things that makes Madison, Wisconsin so successful is they have a huge UW-Madison Research Institute there, the research university. And it's a really good symbiotic relationship between the university and all of the tech companies that have located there and sprouted up. So I think that provides a really good opportunity to keep the innovation engine going. So for a place like Hong Kong that's really investing in, already has these great universities and is continuing to invest in talent, that's a really positive development. You mentioned, Hong Kong being small. I don't think that's necessarily a disadvantage. On the one hand, Hong Kong is highly interconnected with the rest of the world. A lot of trade passes through, people, ideas, but beyond that, there are other very small yet highly innovative cities and countries around the world that we visited. Places like Tel Aviv in Israel, Stockholm in Sweden. Israel, tiny country, but spends the most per GDP on its R&D. Something like 4% of its GDP is on research and development. Stockholm in Sweden has had unicorns like Skype, like Spotify. These small places tend to be slightly more homogeneous. They have very good welfare and support for their citizens, which encourages them to take more risks and to be more willing to fail. Another very important thing to ensure innovation is able to foster and grow. So if anything, Hong Kong's smaller size would be an advantage for ensuring that innovation can continue.
Mm-hmm. But it won't work for big data. Let me ask Professor Chai and Stephen Lamb to, if they have any remarks on the same question. Why Hong Kong?
Why Hong Kong? Yeah. I tend to agree with Samuel's points on co-location and the cultural part. Now individual Hong Kong universities get this right on. You need to note that Hong Kong universities are not working in silo. Many of them, at least a couple of them, are run very similar to US university. Collaborative programs with the industry, collaborative programs with other institutions, like Hong Kong UST has a robot collaborative program with Berkeley. MIT set up the innovation node, not in China, but in Hong Kong with Hong Kong Productivity Council. So institutions do realize the strength of Hong Kong and the need for co-location. I mentioned the AI robotic cluster, and I mentioned the other cluster on medical industries. Now under that cluster scheme, one of the themes is to attract international institutions to join their forces with Hong Kong institutions and take advantage of that resource. Culture is another thing I mentioned. The Asian culture is a little different from Western culture when it comes to being tolerant on failure. Okay, so that is something that Asians are smiling in this room. So we need to start from university level to try to change that mindset. We need to, from the society level, gradually change that mindset. It's okay to fail, okay? And many entrepreneurs are also, they fail more than one time before they become entrepreneurs. Right. Yeah.
So I have a singer lined up, but do you want to add anything to this, Stephen?
Well, why Hong Kong? I guess I just a little bit. You know, I cannot speak from university point of view or any policy point of view. But if I'm an entrepreneur, why I pick Hong Kong? If I'm not born in Hong Kong, I would say, first of all, if you want to do something and you have a global idea, with a laptop, you can do it anywhere. All right. Most of the internet company, honestly, with a laptop, you can do it anywhere in the world. Okay. So if I have a laptop, I want to start my team. Hong Kong, why Hong Kong would that be the place? First of all, this kind of kid, I'm from Berkeley, come on. So you want to be in somewhere very cool. That's why San Francisco is so cool, right? But a lot of hipster, right? And then at the same time, why the next level or next wave of startup in New York, now in Austin, Texas, and then over the years, when we talk about Southeast Asia, Beijing, Shanghai, Singapore, even South Korea, Seoul is very, very popular right now. All these guys want to be in a cool place. And if I started a company and I want to attract talent, this group of engineers, whatever, the next wave of talent, also looking for something cool, okay? I guess the audience here are Facebook generations, okay? I guarantee you my team, in the average 25 to 27 years old, they think Facebook is like the old stuff, all right? I don't want to touch it, all right? It's not cool anymore. I'm on Snapchat, Instagram, okay? That's their mentality. And for this group of people, where I want to live around the world where it's exciting, okay? Where I can learn from multicultural background people. Hong Kong exactly is that place. We call it Asia World City when I was a kid. Now, I think that's very, very extreme. When you are in Hong Kong Island, it looks like you are in a foreign country because so many expats, so many Chinese, so many Koreans, so many Japanese, the same place. All right. But when you're looking in Kowloon or something, okay, it's more like a local Hong Kong. But that's why the city have the vibes and the exciting elements that attract all this talent in the future. So
I'm going to cut you off there because I can't wait. I'm struck by the conversation so far, by how extraordinarily different this conversation has been from almost all policy discussions about technology that I've heard in Washington. None of the panel members have mentioned technological leads. The sense that I get, particularly from Professor Chai and from Stephen Lam, is how wide open the environment is. How talent matters, talent development matters, talent mobility matters, how things can be done in various locations, how it's not just the development of new technology, but it's the adaptation of existing technology, sometimes long-known technology. And also, as Stephen put it, it's finding new ways to do old things. Are we worried about the wrong things, or is there an aspect of technological leads that matter?
To me, the technological need is a matter. As an entrepreneur, it doesn't really matter. If for a scientist, I think it really matters. For a country, it really matters, because it cannot define what the country will be in the future. Just give it two examples. In the past, Japan definitely have the best technology around the world. Then after that, United States, right? Now, I guess I can quote a little. In the next 20 years, there will be like Cold War, right? I think that would be a technological Cold War. In the past, the Cold War is like military race, right? In the future, we'll be on technology, on the cloud. Yeah, we are having a war on the cloud, except the trade war, right? We can see the money dollar here and there. But that is the Cold War that I will see. But to an entrepreneur, as soon as I can adapt to that locations, or I can have internet connections, I can build whatever I want on a laptop, then that's not really matter to me.
This is when you kind of get back into the boring policy stuff, but that definitely does have implications for the innovative environment and the innovative ecosystem. And I'm thinking here about things like privacy standards and data standards, which is, as you all probably know, a big discussion right now that actually has implications for AI and other technological developments, things like intellectual property protections and rule of law, and what the legal frameworks are, and whether or not those frameworks exist to protect innovation. I think that's kind of one of the reasons why innovation has actually been slow to develop true innovation, as you're describing in China, is the absence of some of those legal protections. And going back to kind of the macro stuff, financing and the power of the market, and whether you actually have, you know, creative destruction, a much overused but accurate term, because innovation really can only happen and take hold to the extent you've got a lot of ideas, and some of them will work and actually become leaders, but for each leader that emerges, there are many that have to fail, but they only can fail if they're allowed to fail, and you have to have some kind of mechanism for allowing that to happen. So those are some of the kind of fundamental underpinnings that allow for technological progress, and you know, without that, it makes kind of the leap ahead in innovation much more, well, if not difficult, impossible.
Yeah, I'm going to break the. Oh, did you?
I was just going to largely agree with Stephanie, and you know, mention that we do need to be careful that we don't get carried away with all of the positive, and think that, you know, innovation can go on and can only result in good things. You know, when you're part of a group of people from Washington and you go to Silicon Valley, they kind of think, oh, you know, why do we need you? We don't need to worry about the policy, the rule of law implications. You know, and you just look at what's happened in the last 2 years to show that that's certainly not the case. And we do need to keep those in mind, and it's important to keep those dialogues open between the technologists and the policymakers.
Right. I'm going to break the moderator's rule and provide my own answer to my own question, which is, it largely, how you think about technological leads largely depends on the question that you're asking. If you're asking a military security question, then yes, technological differences, technological leads matter for the current force posture and ability to respond. If you're thinking in terms of an American company, technological differences matter because they're things in which you can earn profits, economic returns. So that loss of technology to a competitor's development of an alternative technology, or as Stephanie mentioned, the development of an alternative that largely makes your product obsolete, lowers the economic return that you face, and countries have and often have expressed an interest in the welfare and profits of their own corporations. But there's also the issue of growth of economies, both individually and the world economy. And the strong sense that I get from this discussion is that it is a global innovation environment in which innovations, development of new products, new activities can take place anywhere and can benefit individuals globally. There's one last question that's coming out of this, because questions of technological leads and technological flows, the transfer of technology, are absolutely central to the U.S. trade conflict with China. They form the basis of the 301 report that USTR did on China. Stephanie mentioned the WTO and the possibility that the WTO can no longer deal with the kind of questions that we face in the international environment. So the question is, in the technology area, do we need, and is it possible to define rules or norms for technological acquisition practices that are acceptable and unacceptable in international affairs? It's a big question, both can they be defined and can they be enforced? But there were a few questions that Stephanie was unable to deal with in my experience, so I'll turn this one over to her.
Well, I think that is one of the kind of fundamental driving questions right now. In one sense, I think, yes, we need rules, but we have them in the sense of rule of law. You have a court system, yeah. You have IP protections that are or are not respected, but that framework already exists. There's a question of whether or not it is being implemented, but that framework exists. And then there are new areas that get at some of the data protections, personal information protections, and that is a framework that very much is in development and is very differentiated across countries. So I would say China actually has a much more developed regime when it comes to data protection, much more restrictive internally, keeping data there, but then who has access to that information internally is also another question, where government may have more access to information than in other markets. Europe has adopted a model where individuals have much more power over their data. And then there's the United States, who has largely kind of punted this issue, and it seems to be we're at a point now where we can no longer do so. But that's a good example where you have a very kind of bifurcated standard. And what does that mean for companies that aspire to be international? Is it possible to be international, an international leader, when you're operating across these potentially 3 different standards? I think that's still one of the open questions.
Anyone else want to wade into this? Okay, I think this is a good time to turn the discussion over to the audience. So see a question there in the 5th row.
Can I ask a question? I'm Jack So from Hong Kong. We can be here very civilized, very calmly talk about innovation, technology, trade, and technology transfer and everything. But I wonder how many of you have listened to President Trump's speech at the UN yesterday. And I did. Now, I think he's putting a different color on various notions that we are familiar with. He calls trade surplus ripping off, which is something new from the days of Adam Smith of competitive advantage. He calls technology transfer and technology cooperation theft, stealing, and breaches of property rights. Now, I wonder if this is a new normal. And if this is the new normal in this country, under this administration, how are we going to pursue what we've been talking about, what we'd love to have, trade, investment, technology transfer, cooperation in the future years? I think this is the question we have to tackle in reality today? Thank you.
So thanks very much for the question. I think, let me take two or three and then we'll answer them in turn. And would you please identify yourself as Mr. So did?
Thank you. I'm Dave Rabinowitz, I'm retired. And one of the motivators for free trade is the concept of competitive advantage, which traditionally referred to geographic advantages. You didn't grow bananas in Canada, you didn't grow wheat in Ecuador. Today, most of the economy is manufacturing, services, and intellectual property type stuff, which can be done anywhere. There is no, the only competitive advantage today is the willingness to accept less money for what you're doing. So basically, competitive advantage is a race to the bottom. Is this really what we want? Or do we need some innovation in the whole economic and trade theories?
Okay. And one more. Okay, while you're thinking of that, let me briefly characterize the questions and then turn them over to the panel. I think the first question raises three issues. One is the unthinkable possibility that President Trump is wrong. Whether he's wrong or right, is this a temporary phenomena or a departure from what will be the norm of the United States and elsewhere? Or is this the new reality of the way in which people look at trade and technological transfer? God, I thought I'd fixed that. The second question is about comparative advantage. If everybody can do everything, what allows some people or countries to do things better? So
I can try to start with the new normal. So being in our Foresight practice, this is certainly something that we think about a lot over the long term. You know, what is the world going to look like in 2030, 2035? And you know, there are different scenarios, and one of them certainly is that this is a new normal, and we might be going down this path in which there are, a trade war, protectionism, disruption to supply chains. But just because that's one possible scenario doesn't mean it's the only possible scenario. There are other alternative futures out there, certainly those that are more positive and optimistic. And so it really kind of depends on the policy choices and strategies that we adopt now to try to go more toward those positive options as opposed to some of the more pessimistic ones. But I do think, looking at the Section 301 investigation and a lot of the points that were brought up, there are definitely practices that do need to be addressed and brought up. You hear a lot of American companies, talking about the difficult business environment. But just as a counter, just to throw out there, speaking with one American business in Beijing, they kind of said, the Americans just don't know how to negotiate well with the Chinese. So he was sort of on a different side of it, which I thought was a little bit interesting. You certainly don't hear that a lot. But I think it's important to think about not just if this is a new normal, but what might be some of the other possibilities out there and how can we work toward those.
I think on the question new normal, I think yes and no. I think President Trump's view on trade and focus on bilateral trade balances and a conviction that a deficit is somehow being robbed, I think that's an outlier view. I don't think that is a new normal, and certainly economists, but I think just policymakers and anyone really paying attention to the issues doesn't have that same, what I think a lot of people view as a very antiquated view of trade and of how the global economy works. But I do think this skepticism about globalization, and this kind of goes to your question, I think that is real, and I think that cuts across party lines, certainly in the US, and I don't think is just a US phenomenon. And I think part of that is a reflection of trade and globalization being a force for disruption, but also confusing that force for innovation and automation, which I think most people think is a much bigger source of disruption, and that we've only started to see that disruption. And the adequacy or inadequacy of national governments, as Secretary Yao was saying, to adapt to that. And you have this global force then creating these disruptions, but if it's at the national level that we're responding to those disruptions, and some governments are more proactive and others maybe not even correctly identifying the problem, I think that's when you have a push against these forces. And I think that probably is going to be with us well past a Trump administration.
Well, I think for the first question, I think it won't be the new normal or new norms. Okay, it will be new normal for the next 2 weeks. That's the maximum. With a background from Berkeley, I travel to Silicon Valley quite often. I think whatever, I didn't watch the video or whatever what he said yesterday in the UN, but I think I can pretend my friends in the Bay Area that are working in startup, technical company, that their response will be like this: yeah, whatever. As an entrepreneur, I think no matter what the administration is trying to do, most of the great entrepreneur I learned from is just we need to adapt whatever is changing around the world. If we are in the state, then we need to play with the rules that guiding this country. And if I'm working in China, I have to follow the laws over there, right? But at the same time, I have a strong faith in America that no matter what the administration is trying to put out a new law out there, then America will still be the most open-minded country to do innovative stuff. The reason why is because I believe in the people here. Just American, that when you deal with some problems or questions, and then when you are dealing this with American, you have certain type of stereotyping that you trust this group of people. And this based on my education here. Because the ethical value and standard here is quite strong to a point that, for example, even privacy is one of the issues that we have been discussing strongly around the world, especially here in America. But at the end of the day, even though you look online, people are making rational discussion that how that privacy issue against our basic value as Americans, as human beings, as humanity. That is great discussion. You don't see that kind of debate and discussion around the world. You know, in China, it's yeah, privacy, yeah. Do we really have, if you walk by the street and then the government know who you are? Is that some privacy that we should talk about, or some your online privacy that everyone posting online is real name already? That's no privacy. Everyone under the real name system. It's different point of view. But here we got all this open discussion. So that's the first point that I still trust. This would be one of the most innovative country around the world. In regards to the second question with this gentleman, that is a really good question that I guess is one of my takeaway with this session today. When we look at trade and manufacturing, and I kind of take a page from what I learned here in Berkeley, is so the competitive advantage is you do something better, so you trade with other people, right? In the past, we call everything made in China, especially, I guess this cup is made in China, but now all this manufacturing, based on the environment, they are switching to other countries. Recently, one of the most popular locations is Vietnam, Cambodia. Are they really making this cup better than China or better than America? It's just cheaper. And now the trade and all this technology, logistics, allow whatever country to do things cheaper than you sell to the world. I guess that's something that innovative that we need to talk about. Is that the new basic of trade? If the trade that we are talking about is its absolute dollar sign on the cost, then what is trade? Would that violate what we learned from Adam Smith from the beginning? World changed. There were no internet by the time that there's Adam Smith writing that book. I forgot the name, but anyway, that's the point that I guess I would challenge ourselves to think about. And if that is the case, I guess the policymaker need to aware of that.
Well, as an economist, I have to say having the wealth of nations dismissed so casually really hurts. Let me say two things in response to these questions. First, President Trump is not the United States, although he exerts very large influence, particularly over trade policy currently. And the United States is not the world, even though it forms a very large part of the global economy and has a considerable influence on global economic policy. There is in the United States now a debate about the tactics of the administration in raising tariffs. The costs on U.S. producers, including U.S. farmers, of the trade policies that the administration has adopted, and the possibilities that the United States will ultimately lose by the pursuit of a unilateral trade policy. As the United States becomes more nationalistic and protectionist, other countries are pursuing further trade agreements. Japan with the European Union, Japan with the pushing forward of the Comprehensive Partnership for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Hong Kong is engaged in negotiation of a number of free trade agreements, as is Korea. What we're seeing is a bifurcation of international economic policy, with the United States heading off in one direction, other countries in another direction. This is a point that I've made several times in discussions, but by far the strongest influence on U.S. trade policy and U.S. trade liberalization has been the perception that the United States is losing out because other countries have preferable access to foreign markets than does the United States. I strongly believe that the United States will veer back over time. It may not be in this administration, but it will be in the future. For the question about comparative advantage, I think there are two, possibly three questions. Why do countries trade? Why are there income differences across countries? And will those income differences persist? And finally, at least for me, is there a difference between trade policy and incomes or distributional policy? I think countries trade because when you look at the geographical boundaries, some activities are better done in one location than another location. Samuel has talked about innovation clusters, about the development of activities in clusters, and about the development of technologies that are specific to particular regions, at least initially. Plus their geographic advantages that still persist. You won't transfer the Great Plains of the United States to China. The second question is, why are there income differences? And the answer there, this is a question that has plagued, absorbed economists for generations. But there are differences in productivity across international boundaries, and there are differences in institutions that support higher incomes, greater activity in certain countries than others. I mean, you can move 20 miles from Southern California into Mexico, and the level of per capita income drops sharply, largely as a result of superior institutions and societal capital between the two nations. The final question, I think, is trade versus incomes policy. There will, I think, always be differences that support higher incomes, that will make certain activities more expensive in some countries than others. That will, and those boundaries will change over time. Countries, individuals gain in total by being able to trade, basically by producing goods where they're most efficient and at lower cost. But societies certainly have pressure, and I believe some responsibility, to respond to sharp changes in income brought about by policy decisions to pursue open, largely free trade. And that's the situation in which we're in now. To avoid trade or erect trade barriers because you don't want to or can't pursue incomes redistributional policy, I think is a huge loss, both in national income and national potential. Yes.
Ken Dillon, Ciencia Press. About investment by Chinese in the United States. Clearly that it will be challenged in CFIUS and in other ways in terms of high-tech, sensitive military type things and so on. But there are a whole lot of other dimensions of the American economy into which Chinese investment could flow. Do you see that on both sides, on the Chinese side and on the American side, there are serious efforts to encourage this flow?
So the recent past has actually seen a huge influx in Chinese foreign direct investment into the United States. So I think a record year was 2016 and still very high last year. I think for the recipients of that investment, for private sector participants, I doubt highly that up until very recently have they really been paying attention to this policy debate in the United States. And I think if they're able to attract foreign capital, regardless of if it's from Europe or Canada or China, I think their concern is getting foreign investment in. What we've seen in the first half of this year has actually been a pretty sharp decline in Chinese foreign direct investment. And I think that's probably driven by two factors. One, domestic to China and some restrictions on outflows that has just cut down on Chinese foreign direct investment globally. But also that there is now, I would say, a chilling effect on Chinese investment that probably cuts across sectors. And I think part of that is a perception that it is going to be much harder for Chinese investment in certain sectors for sure to be approved. And I think your question was, is there an effort to then counter that? I think that's the debate that CFIUS is actually grappling with. We had an event at CSIS yesterday that was kicked off by Chairman Henserling of the House Financial Services Committee, and he went to great pains to make the case that the legislation as passed is designed to maintain the open investment climate in the United States. And a number of the speakers on the panel made that point as well. So I think CFIUS and the US government and other governments are actually struggling with getting that balance right between maintaining open investment but also protecting national security. And there are voices on both sides. It's just the national security one I think has become louder.
Yeah, I think that's right. CFIUS gets a lot of, the U.S. investment screening mechanism, CFIUS, gets a lot of attention, but it involves a relatively small portion of the investment from China or from any other country. You talk to any governor, and the question that you get is quite clear. Yes, we will do all we can to encourage foreign investment from China, from elsewhere in the United States. I think Stephanie is right. The boundaries of what is restricted by CFIUS, by investment screening, are gradually increasing, but they still cover restrict a relatively small amount of investment. So you take, I guess, two more questions. So,
My name is Kathleen Kuhn, I'm retired, and I'm sorry, thank you. My name is Kathleen Kuhn, retired, and I have a question. Even though the statements of the president does not reflect the everyday American, it does reflect the fear that many Americans have for their way of life. And is this understanding understood with our trade partners in Asia and China, this palpable fear that many people have for the disruption of their way of life?
You've been very...
Can I clarify the question? The disruption of way of life. What is the... Economically. We have an hour. No, just on the trade front. You know, I tend not go into too deep on trade issues and focusing back on Hong Kong, okay, rather than China, because we are from Hong Kong. We speak from Hong Kong's perspective. Now, regarding the trade, whether the foreign partners as the Hong Kong as the partner to U.S. trade, I mean, we have zero tariff, and then U.S. maintain the largest trade surplus with Hong Kong in the world, okay? Largest trade surplus, and paraphrasing John Slosser and others, okay, when we never complain. So how does Hong Kong is not going to affect anyone in U.S. in that aspect of making the citizens of U.S. be fearful of anything happening. Whereas China, I do not know from what perspective. I mean, from the perspective of globalization and whatnot, okay, I totally agree that local government needs to take care of the mechanism, because in a way you benefit from the low price products and whatnot. I used to live in the US, and I keep saying that I still have not seen the price on retail shelf change since 15 years I've left US. That's the reality. Now what has made that happen? Now we know why it happened, but if we want to reverse that, okay, we want to reverse the manufacturing and whatnot, what will be the consequence? I do not know. I don't have the answer. So that is for the local government to address. Yeah. So maybe a short answer.
So, wait. Please. And this will be the second to last question. Will be the last question, okay. May not be the last answer, but it'll be.
Ray Fan from Stewart & Stewart. I'm wondering if everyone on the stage could envision that in 5 years from now, what the tech and innovation landscape could look like in Hong Kong, China, between mainland and Hong Kong, and between China and the United States. Thank you.
I'm just speaking out from my imagination, right? And this is exactly the questions that as an entrepreneur I ask myself every day, because I need to position my company in 5 years. And before some company or some smart kid from MIT or from Beijing suddenly have an excellent idea, then tomorrow my company or myself becoming like nobody. So start off with Hong Kong. I think Hong Kong right now is trying to do a lot more for the future, which is I am strongly happy with it. I just love seeing the current Hong Kong. We always complain that we missed the boat for the last 10 years when all this technological advance that for the last 10 years, and then we seems like we still at Hong Kong is a financial center. Other than that, we have a lot of very expensive property. What else we have? Then now Edward has mentioned that we put a lot of focus in startup, in SME, in business, and now the business environment in Hong Kong actually is good for all these startups to grow. So that's the first thing that I see. In 5 years' time, there will be a lot more startup in Hong Kong, and these kind of companies will bring excellent talent and new technology to Hong Kong, which including AI, which I just mentioned, several AI companies has been based in Hong Kong. I guess in 5 years, we will see autonomous vehicles both in China and America. These are the two top countries that will get this kind of technology to the best. We really need to use it, that kind of mentality, to deploy it. And then robotics and then other medical stuff. I think US will be much more advanced in medical tech. All this neuroscience or even all this biochemical that is making human being have a better life. All right? When you look at DNA testing technology, America actually is the top of the world. The cost of DNA testing, I think, is the cheapest here in America. You can just pay for like $29.99 or even $99 there for some testing that you get all your genes that are analyzed, and you know your ancestor from where. Okay, I think it's the cheapest place here, and that would lead to a lot more innovation on medical, because DNA testing is kind of the infrastructure on getting how we serve better for any biomedical cell on a human. That is the basics. It's just like the CPU is getting cheaper and cheaper. That's why we have a cell phone that is much more powerful than a computer 10 years ago or mainframe 10 years ago. The DNA will be that fundamental. But for China, I guess for the next 5 years, we will much more innovative on getting the current tech into a application layer. For example, all this sharing bike stuff that we think very innovative, actually is putting all different current tech together, apply to the market, because we have a huge market that a lot of people can use. Right. So that would be
my answer. If I'd known your question, I would have asked you to ask it at the beginning rather than the end. Professor Chai?
Yeah. Short comment. Questions will be 5 years' time, what happens to Hong Kong? What's the relationship between Hong Kong, China, Hong Kong, US, and whatnot? Okay. Internationalization of R&D. That's the answer. No, I anticipate that there will be more collaboration, more people flow. In the last 5 years, I am seeing more and more startup companies, not started by homegrown individuals like Stephen, but by expats, foreigners, young graduates coming to Hong Kong from US, from France, from Europe. So internationalization factor. Rob, you were saying why innovation in Hong Kong, and then you said, okay, why innovation in the first place? Military defense company adding the value. Right. Okay. Third important factor, where the market is. Yep. Because every single market has regulatory issues. That's a good point. Okay, of controlling where the technology grows, how the technology is being applied to that local society. Now, China is a big market, world's second largest economy, everyone knows. So being close to the market distinctly gives you that advantage. And going back to why Hong Kong question, because it's part of China, yet you enjoy the one country, the second system, all the advantage that you could have, plus the talent flow. So if that could be my last remark.
Okay. And since we're the Atlantic Council, thought I would end with the Global Innovation Sweepstakes study, which Sam worked on, and give him the last word, and then we'll close.
Sure, so I'll keep it very short. I guess in the next 5 years, I would see a convergence of all of these different technologies. So when we talk about new emerging technologies, we tend to list them off and might think about them separately. Artificial intelligence and machine learning, robotics, biotechnology, 5G, the Internet of Things, autonomous vehicles. I think by 2023, you will see a lot of overlaps, AI implemented with the medical devices. Those will be connected to an Internet of Things, so you can track and monitor heart rate and glucose levels from afar. Autonomous vehicles will be plugged into the network as well. So a lot of challenges come with that, but definitely a lot of opportunities as well. So I would say we'd see a convergence of tech.
So this has been a wide-ranging panel much more optimistic, I believe, on technology issues than on policy issues. Ultimately, I think technology drives economies much more strongly than policy does. So it's, I think, an optimistic conclusion in that regard. I want to thank you all for joining us, in which what I think has been a very interesting and important panel. Thanks very much.